All right, let's do this one last time. My name is Peter Parker. I was bitten by a radioactive spider, and for 10 years, I've been the one and only Spider-Man. I'm pretty sure you know the rest.
With great power comes great responsibility.
I saved a bunch of people, fell in love, saved the city, and then I saved the city again, and again, and again, and again. And I did this. We don't really talk about this. Look, I'm a comic book, I'm a serial, did a Christmas album, I have an excellent theme song, and a so-so popsicle. I mean, I've looked worse, but after everything, I still love being Spider-Man. I mean, who wouldn't? So no matter how many hits I take, I always find a way to come back. Because the only thing standing between this city and oblivion is me. There's only one Spider-Man. And you're looking at him.
Well, that's not strictly true, is it? Spider-Man is one of the most popular characters from modern literature and one of the most adapted in modern day cinema, seeing 4 separate reboots or reimaginings for separate adaptations in the last 17 years alone between 2002 and 2019. To put this into perspective, in 2018 Hugh Jackman and Sir Patrick Stewart were honoured for their portrayals of Wolverine and Professor X over the previous 19 years, from 1999. So that's 1 Wolverine, 2 Professor X's,
McAvoy or Stewart? These timelines are so confusing.
and for Spider-Man there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6...
Okay, enough!
So I'll get into that later. But before all that, what is the whole idea of adaptation? As Walter Benjamin puts it, storytelling is always the art of repeating stories, and this goes all the way back to classic narratives.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Because the structure of storytelling remains largely the same in mainstream cinema especially. This is quite well illustrated by Todorov's narrative theory, otherwise known as the 3-act structure. This is formed of an equilibrium, a disequilibrium, a resolution, and a new equilibrium. As John Yorke puts it in his book Into the Woods, he asked his agent Peggy Ramsey what this structure thing was, and she replied, "Oh darling, it's just 2 or 3 little surprises followed every now and again by a bigger surprise." He later remarks that as a superficially glib, but actually a brilliantly pithy analysis underpinning down firmly the essential structural ingredient of drama, the act.
It's kind of a great time. Superman is dead. Superman is not dead. That's it.
A classic example of the 3-act structure can be seen in Star Wars, as well as Vladimir Prop's character theory. Luke Skywalker, the hero, a lonely farm boy, lives with his aunt and uncle until one day he runs into 2 droids carrying a message intended for an Obi-Wan Kenobi. Luke meets Obi-Wan, the mage.
Hello there.
Luke's family is killed and he sets off with Obi-Wan and the droids to save Princess Leia. Here we have the disequilibrium and the hero's journey mapped out. From there, we have the 2nd act conflict, revolving around the discovery of the Death Star.
That's no moon. It's a space station.
As well as the introduction of Han Solo, props the Rogue.
Everything's perfectly all right now. We're fine. We're all fine here now. Thank you. How are you?
After the sacrifice of the mage, Obi-Wan, we enter into the 3rd act, involving a large-scale assault on the Death Star, Luke firing the proton torpedoes into the exhaust port, and Vader being sent off spinning through space.
This is ground control to Major Tom.
This is our resolution. And our new equilibrium is Luke becoming what he always wanted to be all along, a hero of the rebellion. Though Chewie didn't get a medal, and that is criminal in my opinion, and I don't care what anyone says. If we take this film on its own as it was originally intended, we can see the narrative threads begin to build. On top of this, it can be argued that Star Wars is an adaptation in of itself of Akira Kurosawa's film The Hidden Fortress, which was by no means a new idea in Western cinema of remaking Asian films for Western audiences. Another classic example of this can be seen in 1963's The Magnificent Seven and its 2016 remake, adaptations of another Akira Kurosawa film, The Seven Samurai. What I'm trying to say is that the 3-act structure and the idea of remaking and reimagining is one of the oldest storytelling concepts. From Greek and Norse myths all the way through to Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology and Stephen Fry's Mythos. The reimaginings and the reworkings keep people interested. As Kirby Ferguson puts it, everything is a remix, and the idea of a remix boils down to 3 steps: copy, transform, combine. So why am I talking about all this, and what does Spider-Man have to do with it?
Hey, are you okay?
I don't think my atoms are real jazzed about being in the wrong dimension.
Well, the character's cinematic triumphs over the last 2 decades, and with 2018's Into the Spider-Verse, adapting seemingly the most unadaptable characters, I felt it would be appropriate to do so. However, Spider-Man is by no means the most adapted character, because according to nrkmusic.com, the 4 characters with the most cinematic portrayals in film are Santa Claus, God, Dracula, and Sherlock Holmes. I guess that should also include Dr. Watson, so it should be 5, but for the sake of argument, let's say 4. I remember being sat in the cinema and watching The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and having a strange sense of deja vu, that I'd already seen this film, and I was asking myself how, because I know for a fact that I hadn't. Or had I? The Amazing Spider-Man 2 in 2014 came as the 5th Spider-Man film in the last 12 years from Sony and Columbia Pictures, and that's when I began to notice the narrative threads and trends all being repeated or remixed, but with the same character. Already we'd seen Peter Parker being bitten by a spider, him refusing to stop a robbery because of his hubris, resulting in the death of Uncle Ben, which in turn drums into him and all of us in the cinema that...
with great power comes great responsibility.
And a more long-winded and less catchy version of the phrase.
Your father lived by a philosophy, a principle really. He believed that if you could do good things for other people, you had a moral obligation to do those things. That's what's at stake here. Not choice, responsibility.
That's nice. That's great.
And from there, we've seen him hunt down the killer in a prototype suit, him make his own suit, and see mentor and father figures become his greatest nemesis. We've also seen his best friend become the Green Goblin and try and murder his girlfriend twice, though one time he actually succeeded. Actually, this moment in of itself is an adaptation from Spider-Man issue 121, otherwise known as The Night Gwen Stacy Died, and has been referenced in many other incarnations, such as this scene from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man.
Now shoot!
This plays into Walter Benjamin's idea of the art of repeating stories, but why is it so important for filmmakers to repeat these moments, adapting them and translating them from the comics into film? But to understand that, we need to know the fundamental elements that embody Spider-Man's character, that are seen as almost universal to most versions. For starters, on a visual level, the suit itself is iconic, with its red and blue design and the white eyes, and the layout of the elements on the suit. But on a more metaphorical level, you have the everyman aspect of Spider-Man. He's the fish out of water, he has an unsettled family dynamic, such as the absence of Peter Parker's parents, and the murder of Uncle Ben, hammering home the ethos, with great power comes great responsibility. And that's what Spider-Man stands for, whatever the interpretation. But these main ideas are what's translated into any adaptation of the character in any other medium, be it television, cinema, or video game. The idea of adapting Spider-Man into film has been quite the laborious process of fits and starts, starting with the first series in the 1960s starring Nicholas Hammond, and Canon film Spider-Man, which nearly got off the ground, never did. Then again in the 1990s, James Cameron was hired to write and direct a Spider-Man film with Leonardo DiCaprio to potentially star, and a slightly risque theme to the film. But when that was disbanded, Sam Raimi stepped in to produce the film with Columbia Pictures, where the cinematic rights have remained ever since, after Marvel sold them off to avoid bankruptcy in the 90s. Sam Raimi's interpretation, at face value, doesn't deviate that far from the original Amazing Fantasy number 15, with Peter's discovery of his powers, the wrestling element, and the death of Uncle Ben, a dynamic which we have all become far too familiar with.
With great power comes
Don't
great...
you dare finish that sentence. Don't do it. I'm sick of it.
Why is Spider-Man one of the characters we know so much about? Following on from Walter Benjamin's statement, it's effectively been drilled into us at this point. But aside from that, he broke the mold. He was the original hard luck hero. The protagonist of the comic was the representation of the reader, not a billionaire or an alien. He was just a teenager in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or right place, depending on how you look at it.
We tried to make our characters have feet of clay. Now, poor Spider-Man. I mean, okay, he's pretty good at catching bad guys, but he's apt to get an allergy attack while he's fighting. He worries about dandruff. He'll have an ingrown toenail, tears his costume. His Aunt May won't let him go out to save the world because he's not wearing his galoshes and it's snowing out. And the funny thing is, I started doing that as a gag and really to keep myself awake, you know. And I found that the readers are as crazy as I am. They started enjoying this sort of thing. So after 20 years of writing pap and writing things like the strips you mentioned before, I suddenly realized, gee, I can actually have fun with what I'm doing. And now, the more realistic we make our characters, the more the college kids who read them think that it's satire, which has taught me a very great lesson. The world is so crazy that if you present things the way they really are, it comes across as broad satire. And
this makes the idea of Peter Parker as a protagonist fairly universal. A teenage boy just trying to do the right thing because he has the means to do so. As John Yorke puts it, what an archetypal story does is introduce you to a central character, the protagonist, and invite you to identify with them. Effectively, they become your avatar in the drama, and Spider-Man is no exception to this. In the Raimi version, Peter Parker is introduced as the narrator, where he takes the audience through the typical high school stereotypes on the bus before cutting to the outside, revealing that he's the one chasing the bus, symbolising him immediately as the character set apart from everyone else. He is metaphorically and literally on the outside looking in. This emphasises the audience's empathetic connection to the character. Then again, Mark Webb uses a similar means of introduction with Andrew Garfield's interpretation in 2012's The Amazing Spider-Man. He's still the underdog. Within 5 seconds of us seeing the character for the first time, he's hit in the head with a basketball and set apart from the rest of the students. And in a few shots, he's literally seen walking in the opposite direction to the others, symbolising him as being on a different path to everyone else. Why is Peter Parker starting out as an underdog an inherent part of adapting Spider-Man? Well, for one, it remains true to the source material of him being the underdog. And the second reason is exactly that. He's the underdog. And that's the crucial element to his character in adaptation. To make audiences, and has made audiences, fall in love with the character. Having said that, Yorke says, the key to empathy does not lie in manner or good behaviour, nor does it lie, as often claimed, in the understanding of motive. It lies in the ability to access and bond with our unconscious. Though Peter Parker as a character may be a well-mannered and motivated young man, his circumstances make him a sympathetic and empathetic character, allowing the audience to project themselves onto the character, and that's the key of the adaptation of Spider-Man. He's the guy who's in the back of the room, on the outside looking in, he's the hero behind the mask. This is evident in other adaptations and underpins the whole idea of the character, particularly in 2018's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. The central ethos of the film is that anyone can wear the mask. The film introduces African Latino-American Miles Morales, the Spider-Man from the Ultimates. He's a character created by writer Brian Michael Bendis and artist Sarah Pichelli, first appearing in Ultimate Fallout No. 4 in August 2011 following the death of Peter Parker. Miles obtains powers similar to that of Peter Parker and becomes the next Spider-Man. A very similar premise is shown in Into the Spider-Verse, which is an adaptation of this comic amongst other things, like the Spider-Verse comic series itself, introducing a plethora of spider people. But Miles' story is a strong mirror to that of Peter Parker's, and this is critical in his adaptation from the comic books.
Please keep... Wait. How could there be two Spider-Men? There can't be two Spider-Men. Can there?
At the start of the film, we immediately see Miles as a fish out of water, in very relatable situations for many audience members. Attending a new school and struggling to fit in, this creates the empathetic nature that Yorke describes in a central protagonist. He bonds with our unconscious and our subconscious. It could be said that Miles' mixed race background also makes him more appealing as a character to wider audiences, making certain cultures feel like they could be represented by a character. In a similar way that the film Black Panther took a stand against racial prejudices in mainstream cinema by practically having an all-black cast. Most of the elements used to build Miles' character mirror that of Peter Parker's, right down to the loss of an uncle figure. Though this comes slightly out of order to Peter's character arc, the sentiment remains the same. Narratively, a lot of the films in the Spider-Man franchise are quite similar, as said before. However, more recently, I believe the filmmakers have become more aware about the fact that audiences are aware of the origins of Spider-Man. So when Tom Holland's interpretation was introduced, it was very different from the previous versions we've seen before.
What are you doing? Hey, I'm Peter.
First of all, he's not introduced in a Spider-Man film, but as a side character in 2016's Captain America Civil War, where he's recruited by Tony Stark to fight alongside him against Captain America. This scene is quite narratively interesting, especially for setting this version of Spider-Man apart from other interpretations. We get a lot of established Spider-Man elements from our first meeting with him. First off, we see that he's a nervous teenager meeting his idol Tony Stark, which is very relatable because he seems almost starstruck, which he would be in that situation, because it builds into the narrative arc that the Marvel Cinematic Universe has set up of Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr.'s character, being Iron Man, being a celebrity, and being a superhero in that world. So Spider-Man filters into a larger universe. We see he lives with Aunt May, and we also get a time frame of having his powers.
Why are you doing this?
because I've been me my whole life, and I've had these powers for 6 months. I read books, I build computers. And yeah, I would love to play football, but I couldn't then, so I shouldn't now.
Sure, because you're different.
Exactly. But I can't tell anybody that, so I'm not.
I'm taking you on a field trip.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
And it's not until his first solo outing in the MCU, Spider-Man Homecoming, that we get a hint to the death of Uncle Ben.
May cannot know. I cannot do that to her right now. You know? I mean, everything that's happened with her, please.
So already in one scene, we see that this version is a fairly accurate adaptation of the character, before he's even put on the Steve Ditko-inspired suit. Even down to the round emblem on the back and the small emblem on the chest, which has never been portrayed cinematically up to that point.
You have a metal arm? That is awesome, dude! You have the right to remain silent!
The film Into the Spider-Verse takes a less conventional approach to the character by introducing a multitude of different spider people. All of them have the deep-rooted philosophy of the character, but are expressed in different ways, and adapted from different comic incarnations of the character. Aside from Miles, his mental figure is seen in a subverted version of Peter Parker, a Spider-Man in his late 30s and a more vulnerable version of the character.
I'm pretty sure you know the rest. You see, I saved the city, fell in love, I got married, saved the city some more, maybe too much. My marriage got testy, made some dicey money choices, don't invest in a spider-themed restaurant. Then like 15 years passed, blah, 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 super burn. I broke my back, a drone flew into my face. I buried Aunt May, my wife and I split up. But I handled it like a champion.
Spider-Gwen, or Spider-Woman, an adaptation of Peter's original comic book girlfriend and the victim of the Green Goblin, we discover in the film that she's lost her best friend. She also works as a secondary mentor to Miles. Spider-Man Noir, a private eye version of Spider-Man from the 1930s, voiced by Nicolas Cage.
I like to drink egg creams, and I like to fight Nazis. A lot.
Penny Parker, or Spider, a character who has a psychic connection to a spider that controls a mechanized spider suit.
This could literally not get any weirder.
It can get weirder. I just washed my hands. That's why they're wet. No other reason.
A spider that was bitten by a radioactive pig, voiced by comedian John Mulaney. He's very differently stylized to the other characters in a more Looney Tunes fashion.
I want you to have this. It'll fit in your pocket. That's all, folks.
Is he allowed to say that? Legally?
What a pig.
I'm right here.
All these characters are bound by loss and circumstance, which is displayed in this scene.
We've all been there. You know, for me, it was my Uncle Ben.
For me, it was my Uncle Benjamin.
For me, it was my father.
For me, it was my best friend.
Miles, the hardest thing about this job is you can't always save everybody.
All of them had someone that they lost, but their central ethos remains the same. There are adaptations of characters that may seem ridiculous at face value, but they all have a deep-rooted ideology that's seen in a plethora of different adaptations of Spider-Man.
You hard-boiled turtle slapper!
Through all the narrative traps and tropes that many of the Spider-Man incarnations may fall under, they can be reworked and remixed into different mediums and incarnations. The central ethos around the adaptations remains the same. There's someone who's trying to do the right thing in the best way they possibly can. Stan Lee said that most people aren't perfect, and his characters have feet of clay. They're characters who are trying to do the right thing and set a good example for young readers. And throughout the adaptations, that's the primary constant within any narrative, if he's a side character or the central protagonist. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko created a character that is enduring and relatable, and rich in narrative and adaptation potential. Storytelling may be the art of repeating stories, but in these repetitions we get a slightly different perspective on a story and a character that has defined Aristotelian art. A poetic character that transcends age, race, gender and creed. And that's the point of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and any version of Spider-Man actually. He's setting a good example, so anyone can wear the mask.
What's your name?
Jorge.
Jorge? I'm Spider-Man.
I'm not running, running, running. No, I'm not afraid of the fall. I'm not scared.
Inspired by his wife, Mary Jane,
I'm not scared.
Our hero Spider-Man is gone.
My husband, Peter Parker, was an ordinary person. He always said it could have been anyone behind the mask. He was just the kid who happened to get bit.
I'm going to miss him. Yeah, we were friends, you know.
Can I return it if it doesn't fit?
It always fits. Eventually.